chapter. It's just the second page, really, of the book. And the only thing to explain is that the scene is set in Calcutta in the late 1950s.
And of course it's about the two brothers.
And it's about, but they're introduced, I believe they're introduced here. Yeah.
Thank you.
They never set foot in the Tolly Club. Like most people in the vicinity, they'd passed by its wooden gate, its brick walls, hundreds of times. Until the mid-40s, from behind the wall, their father used to watch horses racing around the track. He'd watched from the street, standing among the bettors and other spectators unable to afford a ticket or to enter the club's grounds. But after the Second World War, around the time Subhash and Udayan were born, the height of the wall was raised so that the public could no longer see in. Bismillah, a neighbor, worked as a caddy at the club. He was a Muslim who had stayed on in Taliganj after partition. For a few paisha, he sold them golf balls that had been lost or abandoned on the course. Some were sliced like a gash in one's skin, revealing a pink, rubbery interior. At first they hit the dimpled balls back and forth with sticks. Then Bismillah also sold them a putting iron with a shaft that was slightly bent. A frustrated player had damaged it, striking it against a tree. Bismillah showed them how to lean forward, where to place their hands. Loosely determining the objective of the game, they dug holes in the dirt and tried to coax the balls in. Though a different iron was needed to drive the ball greater distances, they used the putter anyway. But golf wasn't like football or cricket, not a sport the brothers could satisfactorily improvise. In the dirt of the playing field, Bismillah scratched out a map of the Tolly Club. He told them that closer to the clubhouse there was a swimming pool, stables, a tennis court, restaurants where tea was poured from silver pots, special rooms for billiards and bridge, gramophones playing music, bartenders in white coats who prepared drinks called Pink Lady and Gin Fizz. The club's management had recently put up more boundary walls to keep intruders away, but Bismillah said that there were still sections of wire fencing where one might enter along the western edge. They waited until close to dusk when the golfers headed off the course to avoid the mosquitoes and retreated to the clubhouse to drink their cocktails. They kept the plan to themselves, not mentioning it to other boys in the neighborhood. They walked to the mosque at their corner, its red and white minarets distinct from the surrounding buildings. They turned onto the main road carrying the putting iron and 2 empty kerosene tins. They crossed to the other side of Technician's studio. They headed toward the paddy fields where the Adi Ganga once flowed, where the British had once sailed boats to the delta. These days it was stagnant, lined with the settlements of Hindus who'd fled from Dhaka, from Rajshahi, from Chittagong, a displaced population that Calcutta accommodated but ignored. Since partition a decade ago, they had overwhelmed parts of Taliganj the way monsoon rain obscured the lowland. Some of the government workers had received homes in the exchange program, but most were refugees arriving in waves, stripped of their ancestral land. A rapid trickle, then a flood. Subhash and Udayan remembered them, a grim procession, a human herd, a few bundles on their heads, infants strapped to parents' chests. They made shelters of canvas or thatch, walls of woven bamboo. They lived without sanitation, without electricity, in shanties next to garbage heaps, in any available space. They were the reason the Adi Ganga, on the banks of which the Tolly Club stood, was now a sewer canal for southwest Calcutta. They were the reason for the club's additional walls. Subhash and Udayan found no wire fencing. They stopped at a spot where the wall was low enough to scale. They were wearing shorts. Their pockets were stuffed with golf balls. Bismillah said they would find plenty more inside the club, where the balls lay on the ground, alongside the pods that fell from tamarind trees. Udayan flung the puttering iron over the wall, then one of the kerosene tins. Standing on the remaining tin would give Subhash enough leverage to make it over, but Udayan was a few inches shorter in those days. "Lace your fingers," Udayan said. Subhash brought his hands together. He felt the weight of his brother's foot, the worn sole of his sandal, then his whole body bearing down for an instant. Quickly Udayan hoisted himself up. He straddled the wall. "Should I stand guard on this side while you explore?" Subhash asked him. "What fun would that be?" "What do you see? Come, see for yourself." Subhash nudged the kerosene tin closer to the wall. He stepped onto it, feeling the hollow structure wobble beneath him. "Let's go, Subhash." Udayan readjusted himself, dropping down so that only his fingertips were visible. Then he released his hands and fell. Subhash could hear him breathing hard from the effort. "You're all right?" "Of course, now you." Subhash gripped the wall with his hands, hugging it to his chest, scraping his knees. As usual, he was uncertain whether he was more frustrated by Udayan's daring or with himself for his lack of it. Subhash was 13, older by 15 months, but he had no sense of himself without Udayan. From his earliest memories, at every point, his brother was there. Suddenly, they were no longer in Taliganj. They could hear the traffic continuing down the street, but could no longer see it. They were surrounded by massive cannonball trees and eucalyptus, bottle brush, and frangipani. Subhash had never seen such grass, as uniform as a carpet, unfurled over sloping contours of earth, undulating like dunes in a desert, or gentle dips and swells in a sea. It was shorn so finely on the putting green that it felt like moss when he pressed against it. The ground below was as smooth as a scalp, the grass appearing a shade lighter there. He had not seen so many egrets in one place, flying off when he came too close. The trees threw afternoon shadows on the lawn. Their smooth limbs divided when he looked up at them, like the forbidden zones of a woman's body. They were both giddy from the thrill of trespassing, from the fear of being caught. But no guard on foot or horseback, no groundsman spotted them. No one came to chase them away. They began to relax, discovering a series of flags planted along the course. The holes were like navels in the earth, fitted with cups, indicating where the golf balls were supposed to go. There were shallow pits of sand interspersed here and there, puddles on the fairway, strangely shaped, like droplets viewed under a microscope. They kept far from the main entrance, not venturing toward the clubhouse where foreign couples walked arm in arm or sat on cane chairs under the trees. From time to time, Bismillah had said, there was a birthday party for the child of a British family still living in India, with ice cream and pony rides, a cake in which candles burned. Though Nehru was Prime Minister, it was a new Queen of England, Elizabeth II, whose portrait presided in the main drawing room. In their neglected corner, in the company of a water buffalo that had strayed in, Udayan swung forcefully, raising his arms over his head, assuming poses, brandishing the putting iron like a sword. He broke apart the pristine turf, losing a few golf balls in one of the bodies of water. They searched for replacements in the rough. Subhash was the lookout, listening for the approach of horses' hooves on the broad red dirt paths. He heard the taps of a woodpecker, the faint strikes of a sickle, as a section of grass elsewhere in the club was trimmed by hand. Groups of jackals sat erect in packs, their tawny hides mottled with gray. As the light dwindled, a few began to search for food, their lean forms trotting in straight lines. Their distraught howling, echoing within the club, signaled that it was late, time for the brothers to go home. They left the 2 kerosene tins, the one on the outside to mark the place. They made sure to hide the one inside the club, behind some shrubbery. On subsequent visits, Subhash collected feathers and wild almonds. He saw vultures bathing in puddles, spreading their wings to dry. Once he found an egg that had dropped intact from a warbler's nest. Carefully he carried it home with him, placing it in a terracotta container from a sweet shop, covering it with twigs, digging a hole for it in the garden behind their house, at the base of the mango tree, when the egg did not hatch. Then one evening, throwing over the putting iron from inside the club, climbing back over the wall, they noticed that the kerosene tin on the other side was missing. Someone took it, Udayan said. He started to search. The light was scant. Is this what you boys are looking for? It was a policeman appearing from nowhere, patrolling the area around the club. They could distinguish his height, his uniform. He was holding the tin. He took a few steps toward them. Spotting the putting iron on the ground, he picked it up, inspecting it. He set down the tin and switched on a flashlight, focusing its beam on each of their faces, then down the length of their bodies. Brothers, Subhash nodded. What's in your pockets? They removed the golf balls and surrendered them. They watched the policeman put them in his own pockets. He kept one out, tossing it into the air and catching it in his hand. How did you come to acquire these? They were silent. Someone invited you today to play golf at the club? They shook their heads. You don't need me to tell you that these grounds are restricted, the policeman said. He rested the shaft of the putting iron lightly against Subhash's arm. Was today your first visit? No. Was this your idea? Aren't you old enough to know better? It was my idea, Udayan said. You have a loyal brother, the policeman said to Subhash, wanting to protect you, willing to take the blame. I'll do you a favor this time, he continued. I won't mention it to the club as long as you don't intend to try it again. We won't return, Subhash said. Very well. Shall I escort you home to your parents, or should we conclude our conversation here? Here. Turn around then, only you. Subhash faced the wall. Take another step. He felt the steel shaft striking his haunches, then the backs of his legs. The force of the second blow, only an instant of contact, brought him to his hands and knees. It would take some days for the welts to go down. Their parents had never beaten them. He felt nothing at first, only numbness, then a sensation that was like boiling water tossed from a pan against his skin. Stop it, Udayan shouted to the policeman. He crouched next to Subhash, throwing an arm across his shoulders, attempting to shield him. Together, pressed against one another, they braced themselves. Their heads were lowered, their eyes closed, Subhash still reeling from pain. But nothing more happened. They heard the sound of the putting iron being tossed over the wall, landing a final time inside the club. Then the policeman, who wanted nothing more to do with them, retreating.
Of course, retreat is mine, because it's in my language. It's in English. And you will have a double treat that this will be is translated now into Swedish, so you'll be able to get the signatures. I wanted to talk a little bit more politically. I wanted to talk a little bit about the backdrop to the Lowlands itself, and a particular time, certainly for India. The book references Vietnam, Martin Luther King, Kennedy, the first man on the moon. It gives you an extraordinary platform, back history. And it's set against something called partition. I don't know how many people out there know about the partition. Yeah, thank you. I'll just read it. I googled this. So I read it. So this is the context. Partition of India was the process of dividing the subcontinent along sectarian lines, which took place in 1947, as India gained its independence from the British Raj. The northern, predominantly Muslim sections of India became the nation of Pakistan, while the southern and majority Hindu section became the Republic of India. This divide was to cause the death of thousands in months and years to come, with refugees fleeing from either the north or the south, depending on how the line was drawn. Land was seized, and sectarian as well as religious violence erupted. The voices that we remember during the peace include Gandhi and Nehru. On August the 14th, 1947, the Islamic Republic of Pakistan was founded. The following day, the Republic of India was established in the south. One of the big questions that came up again and again was, how did Britain manage to control India from 1757 to 1947? God, we were arrogant. It's extraordinary, and it seems that weaponry, profit, and a kind of Eurocentric, if you like, confidence was part of that. So I have two questions. That's a little bit about partition, which runs today, and we know both Pakistan and India have also come to a nuclear position now, where both countries have tested nuclear arms, so it remains a very fragile tension. I wanted to ask why Lowland set against that backdrop. What did this platform give you like no other?
Well, the novel begins in the period after, the decade after partition. So the section I read from is about 10 years on. So India has been independent for about a decade. The bulk of the what I would say the political center of the book is not so much partition, but another moment in India's history, especially in the history of Bengal. A attempted Maoist revolution called Naxalbari, which originates in 1967. So that's 20 years after partition, and then is quickly brought to its heels within a matter of five or 6 years. And there's a central act of violence in the Lowland, which comes out of that moment. But of course, this attempted Maoist revolution in India is the consequence of independence, is the consequence of partition. So it's all sort of an historic flow, if you will. And certainly in this passage that I read, I describe one of the consequences of partition, which was that Bengal was one of the regions of India most deeply devastated by this double migration of Hindus crossing the border one way and Muslims crossing the border the other way. And so what results is a massive influx of refugees. So this is, I think, a theme that's played out in the book again and again. This idea of, people coming in, and the idea of the wall to try to keep the people out, and some people climbing over the wall in spite of there being the wall, and the consequences of that.
Even that little incident with the policeman hitting the boys with that golf club turns out to be horrific violence perpetrated the chapters further on. Lowlands also, I think, in a funny way, brings us full circle. I'm aware of the time as well, and that you've got to test your signing after this. But it brings us kind of full circle in many ways, in terms of when we started to begin with your early stories of loss, of memory, of the choices that are made, whether people are forced to make a choice politically or whether they choose to make that choice in some extraordinary revelations during the book, when you feel you can fall no further in terms of following particularly the two brothers. And here I think in Lowlands also you explore the extremis of those decisions, particularly the brother who then chooses to go to the States. Kind of brings you back a little bit where you lived and have lived yourself. I wanted to ask a final question around Lowlands, really, is that it feels to me, having worked my way through your books, seeing these through lines, these rivers and valleys of these emotions, that you hit a height with Lowland in some way, some kind of intensity. And I think I wanted to ask you, when you'd finished writing Lowland, what did you feel after? Did you feel I'm ready for a new book? Or did you feel that you'd come to a cycle here with Lowlands? It feels like there's some kind of cycle with these books here. How do you respond to that? Do you feel it's the end or the beginning of a cycle of writing for you?
Well, you're absolutely, you're extremely perceptive, because you're absolutely right. I did feel as I was finishing the Lowland that I was at the end of a certain road. And in a way, the Lowland is, it's my fourth book, but I consider it my first book because it was the first book I really tried to write as a book. And I started writing the first pages of the Lowland before, in 1997, so this was 2 years before Interpretive Melodies was published. And though I had written most of the stories in Interpretive Melodies by then, I still didn't really think it was going to be published as a book or anything. So the first book I set out to write as a book was this one. It just took me 17 years to figure it out and put it together. and so I wrote the other 3 books in
Wow.
between. But I do think that you know, it's the book I've been trying to write from the beginning, and I wasn't capable as a writer to write this novel in the beginning, and I'm glad I didn't, and I'm glad I waited until I did feel more or less capable to handle the story and the material. There were things about this book that were very overwhelming, intimidating for me, particularly the historical dimension. I felt, you know, I felt nervous about it only because it is something that I don't know about, and I had to imagine my way into, and that took a lot of time. Also, I feel that what happens with the characters, you know, their actions, their choices are, I mean, it's quite a heavy book in a lot of ways, and it's I think the darkest of the books.
But it's wonderful to see that in you, but to see you go there. I mean, it's very, obviously I've read the Bible of it now, so I feel I know everything, but I mean, to really understand. So I mean, first of all, I feel quite emotional because I really had not planned that. I didn't know there was an end of any cycle, but having read them all, there's some kind of height that comes to your work, some kind of finish. But for me personally, and the recommendations you make, you judge for yourselves, is to watch you really hit the very top of that in this Lowland. You go to the extremis of all of the things that have driven you so far over 17 years. And we've all been waiting. We're very happy for the wait. It's okay. It really is. I think you hit the height of it, and the sorrow and the grief give birth, a bit like the children, to joy and renewal and transformation. You have a courage in the writing, for me, that actually opens the door for us here in Sweden in terms of how we will begin to understand and perceive generations to come, how we can assimilate it to our generations, regardless of what minority or culture or language that we come from. I think this is going to be crucial when you enter the world of Jhumpa Lahiri, absolutely. I've got 3 last things that I like to ask, okay? So don't laugh and don't be angry with me. Okay, it's like just 3 things I wanted to know. The bottom line is that this book, for me, is a key into an existence here that is both universal and global. I detect your star is going to continue to rise, and that you remain one of our epic writers. We need you in Sweden. We have our own equivalents, we have our own writers here, but in terms of that dual heritage, in terms of the idea of the journey and the consequence, something that we are not brave enough yet to analyze from a minority perspective. Jhumpa allows us to do that with a kind of bravery and dexterity. 3 questions. You've got 5 seconds to answer them. Okay, 10. What would you be if you were not a writer? 10, 9, 8.
What would I like to be, or what would I be?
Oh, writer's response. No. Okay. If you were not a writer and you had to choose another profession, what would it be?
It would be something creative. I mean, it would be something artist, something I could do with my creativity.
Yes.
I don't know.
You got it. Okay. This is a classic. As a theatre director, there are plays that I go and see other directors and I go, God, I wish I'd done that. I wish, why didn't I? Or they do a production that I thought I'd done well, and I realise it hasn't been done. Is there a book that you have read that's inspired you, that you wish you had written yourself? 10.
Tess of the D'Urbervilles.
Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Book and freeze. Why?
I love Hardy, and I love his novels, and his novels were my guiding light when I was writing The Lowland. Actually, you know, he is a writer who goes, as you say, to the extreme, and is not afraid to face the darkest questions and the hardest moments. And he writes, I think, one of the best, among the finest great tragic novels in existence. And yet they are very they're very contained, in spite of their being, meaty and dense novels. And also his portrayal of women in particular interests me very much, and the dilemmas that his female characters face, the ways in which society constrains them. He was so perceptive, and I thought about him and his work. I thought about his work a lot, especially a novel like Tess, in the shaping of this book. So.
Okay, last question. As you see, the paper is down. We're coming to the end. As a wordsmith, you can all think about this. What is your favourite word? Don't. What's your favourite word? A word that you come back to? Is there a word that you go, when you say it, when it's in your mouth, or when you write it, you like that word?
I hate to disappoint you, but I cannot answer that question, but I will only say that I love words, and I live for them, and I'm now going through some sort of linguistic something, I don't know how to put it, it's not really a metamorphosis, but some form of transformation in that I've begun writing in a different language.
You're writing in Italian now?
And so...
Yes, just gasp. Explain, yes, apart from being triply, quadruply talented, you're now living in Italy, and you've made a very clear decision. Share with the audience a little bit this decision about language. You're living in Italy now and writing in Italian.
I am, and this is part of a whole other hour-long conversation we could have about language and identity and what that means, perhaps next time. But what this journey has taught me, this new, turning this new linguistic corner in my life, notebooks, little notebooks filled with word after word after word, and the discovery of new words. I think it's the most exciting thing on earth to unpack, explore, uncover, discover a new language. I've been speaking from a writer. I think there is nothing more profound, because I think language is possibly the most profound thing that we have, and it's something that remains very much a wall, in that every language is absolutely specific and unto itself, and represents a world unto itself, has massive reverberations, beyond the dictionary that contains all the words. That dictionary that contains all the words represents a whole culture, a whole people, a whole set of attitudes, what have you. And yet, to be able to explore, it's like exploring a new ocean. And it's very humbling, it's very inspiring, it's very overwhelming, it's all of those things. But I can't think of a single thing in a way. When you talk about this idea of globalization, the reason it feels so almost cheap to me as a term is that, yes, you can buy an airplane ticket and fly all over the place, but can you speak another language? And what does that mean? And to realize how we are, it is something that is so unique, and there are so many of them. There are so hundreds